Beijing has announced sweeping new export controls on rare earth minerals just weeks before the Xi-Trump meeting at this year's APEC summit. We'll discuss this new escalation in the U.S. China trade war and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through all the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. Russia and China condemned growing U.S. military presence in the Caribbean. At an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on Friday, both Russian and Chinese envoys urged Washington to de-escalate, warning that its actions threaten regional stability in Venezuela and Latin America. China's UN envoy Fu Kong stated that the U.S.'s, quote, unilateral and excessive enforcement operations against other countries' vessels in so-called international waters infringe on relevant personnel's right to life and other basic human rights, unquote. Russia's UN envoy Vasily Nebenzia went further to call U.S. claims of drug cartels operating in Venezuela, Washington's justifications for the attacks and military buildup, mythical, describing it as, quote, an excellent subject for a Hollywood blockbuster in which the Americans would once again save the world. But these assertions are not underpinned by facts at all, unquote. The Trump administration has conducted at least 4 strikes over the past few weeks on boats in the Caribbean, killing at least 21 people, alleging that the boats were carrying narcotics from Venezuela with no evidence. Since then, Washington has dispatched warships to the southern Caribbean. Venezuela's UN envoy Samuel Moncada called Trump's narrative a disinformation campaign and accused Washington of having an addiction to oil, saying, quote, the United States promotes endless war with a machine of propaganda and a true industry of death and lies. Venezuela will continue to win peace, exercising its full sovereignty and guaranteeing the right to life. Unquote. China is now building underwater data centers, which could slash power by up to 90%. The move is being led by Beijing-based Highlander Digital Technology, which is preparing to deploy a new series of submerged computing pods off the coast of Shanghai. These underwater installations are expected to cool high-performance servers using ocean currents, rather than the mechanical systems that dominate conventional data centers. Earlier trials off Hainan Island reportedly showed this method could save over 122 million kilowatt hours of electricity and 105,000 tons of water annually. The project, expected to be sunk in mid-October, is one of the world's first commercial services of its kind. It will serve clients such as China Telecom, and a state-owned AI computing company, and is part of a broader government push to lower data centers' carbon footprints. Doctors in China transplanted a genetically modified pig liver into a 71-year-old man. According to the doctors, the man lived 171 days after the operation, and 38 of those days were with the pig liver in place. The findings were published last Thursday in the Journal of Hepatology. According to the paper, doctors at the first affiliated hospital of Arnaud Medical University in China transplanted a liver from an 11-month-old pig into the man in May of 2024. The pig, a clone, had 10 gene edits to reduce the possibility of infection or ejection of the organ. Additionally, doctors gave the man drugs to prevent his immune system from rejecting the pig liver. The man had a large tumor in the right lobe of his liver that chemotherapy failed to remove. The transplant appeared successful until around day 25, when the man's heart showed progressive signs of stress. Over the next few days, the patient's condition began to decline, showing inflammatory changes related to the transplant. By day 37, the man's blood pressure plummeted and he was in and out of consciousness. But doctors assessed his own liver was capable of functioning enough to keep his body going, so they removed the transplant the next day. On day 135, the man developed upper gastrointestinal bleeding, and he died of his bleeding 171 days after the transplant procedure. Even still, scientists consider this a groundbreaking medical achievement. Experts are cautiously optimistic that pig-to-human liver transplantation may be used as a bridge to help a human who has had serious liver conditions live long enough for enough of their own liver to recover or for a donor human liver to become available. Last Thursday, China announced new expanded export controls on rare earth minerals. Trump claims they came out of nowhere. Beijing says this was a response to Washington introducing a string of new restrictive measures just 20 days after their September trade talks in Madrid, including putting multiple Chinese entities on the Entity List and Special Designated National List. In retaliation, Trump announced on Truth Social 100% tariffs in addition to any current tariff, plus export controls on critical software on China by November 1st. As a result, stock markets saw a loss of $2 trillion in a single day. To discuss these new rare earth export restrictions, we are so pleased to have on Arnaud Bertrand. Arnaud is an entrepreneur and geopolitical analyst. He lived in China for 8 years and is now based in Malaysia. Arnaud, welcome to the China Report.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we're so honored to have you. I guess to get started, maybe could you give us an overview of the new regulations that China's Ministry of Commerce announced on Thursday? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like with these new restrictions, China is really locking down its entire rare earth supply chain, an entire rare earth ecosystem, from mining to technology to even expertise and personnel.
Yes, absolutely. So on Plus, it's not only rare earths, but it goes beyond to batteries or even what's called hard materials. So they made 4 announcements on Thursday, which I think is unprecedented. So there was the rare earths stuff, which is basically it's a bit of a mirror to what the U.S. did with semiconductors. They say that it's sort of a dual use, which is the same justification that the U.S. gave for semiconductors. We don't want to export advanced semiconductors to China because it can be used in their weapon industry and so on. China is basically, mirroring that with rare earths. We don't want to export rare earths specifically for dual use to the US. Basically, I mean it's to the whole world, but everyone knows that it targets the US. But dual use, as we know, can be, for a lot of applications. Like you can push the concept of dual use to include, I don't know, even cars, because soldiers, can use cars, or security personnel can use cars. So it's a very broad thing, and basically at the end of the day, it depends on China's. It's a weapon that they have available, and that they can use with the justification of dual use for many things. So it's a very powerful new weapon that China can deploy, basically, where it can cut rare earths for a lot of application. And on top of that, not only it cuts the rare earths themselves, but also anything that enables the West to develop their own rare earth processing capabilities. Right now, the problem is not so much with the supply of rare earths. You can find rare earths pretty much everywhere, but China has almost the monopoly on the refining of rare earths, taking the actual elements from the earth and extracting them, which is quite a complicated industrial process. And there is an entire ecosystem around that, which is dominated by China. And if you want to start doing that processing outside of China, in say the US or Europe, either you start from you have to reinvent the wheel completely, like all the machinery and so on to do everything, or you need China's help. And China basically said with their new export controls, you're not going to get our help, basically. So that's a second big restriction. And then there was what's called hard materials. And I think in a way that's even more broad than rare earth, because we're speaking about industrial diamonds, for instance. Like, in industry, you use diamonds to cut a lot of things. Like for semiconductors, for instance, the way to cut the actual wafers of the semiconductors is with industrial diamond, which is a super hard material, which is very good for cutting. And China also has a quasi-monopoly on that. And just like rare earths, they're saying we're going to use that as leverage, basically. And if they do use it as leverage, this is also an incredibly powerful tool that can, halt many sectors in the West. And last thing, also batteries. And same thing for rare earths, not only the batteries themselves, but also the ways and knowledge to manufacture the batteries, which is also a very big deal because, batteries are used for so many things in today's life. So we're only speaking about, the most advanced type of batteries, the type of batteries which are used in electric cars or advanced electric drones and so on and so forth. But still, again, this is a very powerful move. So basically, right now, if we take a step back and look at the broader picture, we're starting to see that the U.S. has always used finance as a weapon in order to band other countries to their will, basically saying, if you don't do what we like, then your companies are going to be on the entity list, and they're not going to have access to the dollar, and therefore it's going to they're going to go bankrupt. Or we're going to do that to your entire country, like they did to Venezuela or Iran, and then you're going to have an economic crisis, and so on and so forth. So the U.S. has that, and China now basically has supply chains. So they're saying, as a response to the U.S., basically we control supply chains in so many sectors, and we're gonna start using that, and that's going to be extremely impactful as well, because we can kill entire sectors of your economy. So it is a big deal. It's a very big deal.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about killing entire sectors of the economy. There are two things that I immediately think about when you run down all of these new restrictions. The first is the AI industry in the U.S. and how it's so reliant on these semiconductors that need rare earth minerals, and how AI is basically propping up the U.S. economy at this point. AI companies are investing hundreds of billions of dollars into AI infrastructure and development, and other companies are spending billions on AI products, and it's basically driving the U.S. economy forward. So that's one thing I think about. Another thing is I think about the U.S. weapons industry, the defense industry, and how if these export controls go into place, it's going to suddenly grind that to a halt, which I don't think is, necessarily, of course, it's not a bad thing. But I'm just wondering, like, what are the implications for both the U.S. and the global economy due to these export controls? What are the implications for the U.S. military industrial complex and also for the U.S. war on China?
I think the implications is that China is basically a peer competitor that can, hurt the US as much as the US can hurt them. And so the consequence basically is that both countries are going to have to discuss and find some sort of understanding in order to coexist together, because they can both do immense damage to each other. And that's what a multipolar world means, really. A multipolar world means like our generation, we're really not used to that. We've never seen it before in our lifetimes, right? But concretely, that's what it is. It's a world where, contrary to what we've been used to, the U.S. does not dictate the rules anymore. We don't live in a U.S.-led global order, but we live in some sort of equilibrium that's always based on the leverage of the different poles. And so China is showing that it has a lot of leverage. The US still has a lot of leverage. And so, they're seeking an equilibrium right now. And I think, it is scary in a way, because there is always that threat there. And as we see, almost every day, there are some collateral victims of this. We just saw, for instance, that company in Holland, Xperia, that is part of that battle between the US and China, and is getting killed as a result. So there are definitely some scary aspects of that. But there is also, I think, over the long run, some positive aspect, because I studied quite a bit writings from when the world used to be multipolar, especially like around the 15th, 16th century. And I was surprised to see that a key characteristic of such a world was there was a genuine attempt between the poles, between the different civilizations and cultures, to understand each other. Because when you're in a unipolar world, and when basically whatever you say is the rule, and you can just submit others to your will, you have zero need to understand them. It doesn't matter if you understand them or not; they're gonna do what you want anyway. But when you can't do that, when they're just as powerful as you are, then it becomes very crucial to understand them in order to be able to reach some sort of deal, some sort of equilibrium with them. And so I think that bit by bit, maybe I'm being quite idealistic, but I think we're starting to see some of that. Bit by bit, we're going to see a world where there is more emphasis on understanding each other rather than the type of basic supremacy, even cultural supremacy that we've seen in the past.
Mm. You mentioned a couple minutes ago the situation with Nexperia and the government takeover of the Chinese-owned semiconductor company. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how it fits into this overall trade war. I saw this morning that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce had announced that it had placed export controls on the company and that it's been banned from exporting products to China now. So can you talk a little bit about that and how, I saw in your post this morning, you described Europe as being a battleground for this trade war between the US and China. So if you could talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so this case, Nexperia, is a perfect example of what's going on. So basically, there is this Dutch company, Nexperia, that was bought by a Chinese company a few years back, and that Chinese company was put on the entity list, so the American list that sanctions you basically and forbids you to trade in dollar and so on and so forth. But to date, the rule was such that a company could be on the entity list, but its subsidiaries, so the company that other companies that it owned, were not also put on the entity list. So even though the Chinese parent company was on the entity list, Nexperia, the Dutch company owned by that Chinese company, could still do business as usual. And that's what the Trump administration just changed. And the reason why the Chinese rolled out those rare earth export controls, because the Trump administration said, as soon as your parent company is on the entity list, you automatically are on it as well. If the parent company owns more than 50% of your shares, so it's the so-called 50% rule. And what that meant for Xperia, that European company, which is a major European company, it's 14,000 employees. It makes I think in the billions of semiconductors a year. I mean, so it's a big business. What that meant was that business would be killed. Because if you can't use the dollar, if you're on the entity list, it's for a European company, it's a death warrant. Less so for a Chinese company because they have an entire ecosystem, financial ecosystem to circumvent that. They're quite resilient in that regard. That's why. Huawei managed to survive and so on and so forth, but Europe doesn't have that. Like if you're they have zero protection. If you're put on the entity list, you die as a business. And that's what pushed the Dutch government, basically on order of the Americans. The Americans told the Dutch, if you basically seize control of the company away from the Chinese owners, so if you effectively steal the company away from the Chinese company, then you won't be on the entity list anymore. That Xperia won't be on the entity list. And that's exactly what the Dutch did. And that's what we discovered, I think it was this weekend. There was this news in all the newspaper that the Dutch government had effectively stolen Xperia from the Chinese ownership. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say stolen, because they took all the shares of the company, they put it in an escrow account, so the Chinese owners can't touch the shares anymore. They fired the Chinese CEO of the company, and they put a new director on the board with full control. So to me, when you look at companies' governance, that's basically theft of a company. And like you said, the Chinese response to that, which just came, I think, today, today Chinese time at least, was to say, well, since you stole the company from us, then Xperia doesn't have access to China's supply chains anymore. So you can't, get anything from China in order to make your semiconductors, which is also a death warrant for the company. So, no matter what happens, Xperia was going to die, basically. And that's the position of Europe today. So if it doesn't comply with the Americans, then it is put on the entity list and it's dead. But it complied with the Americans, and then it doesn't have access to China's supply chains, and it's dead. So that's the situation that I was posting about on Twitter today, showing that Europe is a battleground for the war the economic war between the U.S. and China. And the especially sad situation is, you have that expression, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. In the case of Xperia, they're not even on the menu at all, because no one is eating Xperia. No, it's just like they crush it and they kill the company. Europe is basically doesn't even have the benefit of being eaten. It's just crushed like a bug during the fight between both giants. That's the status of Europe right now, which is, as a European, pretty sad to see.
Mm-hmm. So I've been following a lot of commentators on, on the current trade war and like these new rare earth restrictions. And a lot of mainstream commentators are saying that the U.S. has the upper hand here because the U.S. market, China needs the U.S. market to export to. But I'm sure you saw this new CNBC article that came out on Sunday, which reported that China beat economists' expectations and that exports were increasing at the fastest pace in 6 months and imports rising at the fastest pace since April of 2024. So compared to a year ago, exports in China grew by 8.3% and imports grew by 7.4% in September. So this despite China's exports to the U.S. falling by 27% in the same time period, while imports declined by 16%. Which all begs the question, who really has the leverage here in this trade war? And does China really need the U.S. market?
So, first of all, I think the figures on decreasing exports from China to the US are always a bit misleading, because what's happening is that if you look at the curve, exports to the US are decreasing, but exports to third countries are increasing a lot. And often what the third countries do is they take Chinese products, they work a tiny bit on it, like adding a screw here or there, and then they sell it to the US, which is actually legal to do. Like, for instance, if you take a Chinese product, import it to Malaysia, just put 2 screws in it, that's it. And then you export it to the US, that's a Malaysian product. That's not a Chinese product, according to the rules of trade now. So, that picture doesn't account for that. And so if you took that into account, I'm sure that Chinese exports to the US would actually not have decreased by that much. And also, if you look, first of all, the Chinese economy overall is way less dependent on exports than what most people assume. They are quite dependent on exports. I think I don't have the exact figure in mind, but it's of the order of between 25 and 30% of the GDP. But it's way less than Europe, for instance. Europe is much more dependent on exports than China, which is a bit counterintuitive. Not many people know that. And exports to the US in particular is something of the order of 2% of Chinese GDP from memory. So very little dependence on that. What's really growing is Chinese exports, to Europe. They're exporting much more to Europe. I think the latest figures are like plus 15 or 16% year on year, and to the global south, in particular, everything related to green energy, electric vehicle, and so on. That's very, very big. If you look, an incredible figure is that 87% of new energy projects in the global south are based on renewables, so solar, wind, and so on. Of course, you have only one country that supplies those, which is China, which now has a dominant market share in this. So overall, I would say that China is not in a bad situation at all. As for the US, I think it's pretty clear that they are quite dependent on China for some things, as we saw with the whole rare earth saga in when was it in May? Almost the entire automotive sector in the US almost came to a halt. So it shows that China's leverage is real in that regard. on the current panic that you've seen in the U.S. after the announcement by China around rare earths shows that there is panic. So it means that it's very worrying to the U.S., which is the entire point.
Well, these new export controls come just a couple of weeks before the Xi-Trump meeting at the APEC summit in South Korea. And a lot of commentators are saying that Beijing announced these new restrictions to use as leverage and in anticipation of these trade talks. But I think a lot of other people are also wondering, why did Beijing wait until now to announce these export restrictions? Like, why didn't they announce these earlier in the trade war?
Yeah, so that's indeed a question I've seen asked a lot. Especially, the trade war has been going on for a while now. It actually started in the first Trump administration, and then you had like the semiconductors export control by the Biden administration and so on. So why would China only use the rare earth card now? And I actually studied the question a bit. And it's because up until quite recently, the US actually had even stronger cards to play that would have been very damaging to China. And one of those cards, for instance, is helium. So that's quite unexpected. Most people, would not know helium as a card that the US had, but helium is not only used for party balloons. It's a very essential input in a lot of industries, including semiconductors, by the way. And up until I think 2022, if I'm not mistaken, China was extremely dependent on the US for helium, and we're speaking like 90% dependent, or that sort of level. And so if it had used the rare earth, then the US would have used helium, and basically, that's a very, very strong card. And so China, for helium and for a lot of other cards that the US could have played, did an enormous amount of work to reduce their dependence. So I looked into helium. Right now, in like 2 years, they cut the dependence to the US to less than 5%. So it's simply not a card that the US can use anymore. And there has been a huge effort inside China to basically deny the US any card it could play. This is, I think, the main reason why it can use the rare earth cards now. And also, there was a lot of work by China on controlling the supply of rare earth in order to be able to use this card effectively. So, as far as I understand, they have, tracking system with rare earths and QR codes to understand exactly which rare earths go where. So, they've planned this for years, and they did like whole of society work basically to make this happen. So, they're very patient and extremely strategic. This was not, a spur of the moment move. This was something that was really planned for years.
No, I mean, I think that really speaks to China's long-term vision and decades of strategic planning, that they were able to identify something like helium or rare earths, identify these vulnerabilities and choke points ahead of time.
Yeah.
And, take the time to build alternative technology, alternative infrastructure to make sure that they weren't like too dependent on the US or too vulnerable to the US, And it's not just like helium or rare earths, Belt and Road is another example of this. The way that they, wanted to, they saw this vulnerability, like having all of their oil imports coming through this maritime trade route that's like dominated by the US military, in which the U.S., if they wanted to, they could just blockade these naval ships carrying oil to China, and that would create escalate a war situation, right? So I think about that, whereas capitalist countries like the US, so they don't have that kind of long-term vision. They're just chasing higher and higher profits. So I guess I'm curious, you lived in China for 8 years. Can you speak a little bit more to this kind of strategic central planning in China versus what we typically see in the US or Europe?
I think there is a hierarchy of strategic planning. I think the Chinese are definitely up there. They plan. They love plans, and I mean, every 5 years you have the 5-year plan, and you had Made in China 2025. You have all sorts of plan all the time. That's basically Chinese governance. It's all about long-term planning. And even if you look, historically, there is in China's even 100 school of thought thinking 2,500 years ago. There was a lot of that already. So it's very deep in the Chinese mindset to be extremely strategic. So that's very, very important in the governance of the country. I think the US are actually not that bad. I think you always need to differentiate between politicians who are completely all over the place and just say, whatever goes through their mind. They're basically marketing tools, and the deep state. And I think the deep state is quite strategic when you read Rand reports, for instance. I don't know if you pronounce it Rand, R-A-N-D. Rand. That's quite strategic. You've got to give them some credit for that. Evil strategic often, but strategic. And the Europeans, us. We are not strategic at all. We are basically, we were thinking we were living in Disneyland during the past 30, 40 years when we were actually living in Jurassic Park, and we didn't know it. So that's basically the mindset in Europe. We thought, we lived in at the end of history, and everything was going to be fine, and everyone was friend. It was all about free trade and so on, but we didn't understand, the deeper dynamic that this was due to U.S. unipolar status and fundamentally U.S. violence, its ability to use violence to keep that status. That got challenged, and now it has peer competitors, and that's gone, and we're sort of rediscovering reality when we should have never forgotten it. So that's why we have things like Nixperia happening in Europe, when is because we did absolutely zero strategic thinking for decades, and we were so stupid that we decided to be under the protection of one of our biggest competitor, because it's basically the US, which is our biggest competitor, which is protecting us with NATO. And of course, when you protect someone, it's basically a protection racket, and you can make them do whatever you want. So yeah, I think it's in terms of strategy, the Chinese are the masters. The Americans are not too bad, and the Europeans are way behind. And specifically for rare earth, already Deng Xiaoping spoke about it, and I think he even said something to. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that the US has No, the Middle East has petrol and we have rare earths, or it was a quote like this, like he understood the strategic importance of rare earth already over 3 decades ago.
Mm. Arnaud, thank you so much for joining us on the China Report today. I'm sure a lot of viewers are already pretty familiar with your work, but in case they aren't, could you let them know where they can find you?
Sure. On Twitter, on Substack, basically, under my name, Arnaud Bertrand.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, the Tai Hong Fire Dragon Dance is an annual mid-autumn festival tradition in Hong Kong. The dance is recognized by UNESCO as a national intangible cultural heritage, and it's also a Hakka tradition that goes back over 140 years. Local legend says villagers first performed the dance to drive away a deadly plague, which was believed to be the revenge of a slain python. The dragon comprises 12,000 incense sticks and is paraded around by over 300 performers. So this is our end segment. As always, if you enjoyed this episode of the China Report, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.